Hi, everybody. Welcome to the ADIA Digital Inclusion Meetup. I think we've got a critical mass now. We might get started and maybe joined by another group of people as we get going. So welcome to the ADIA Meetup. Today's topic is dissecting the data on digital inclusion. And this is presented in partnership with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. It's wonderful to have so many of you from across the digital inclusion community joining us today. And welcome also if you're watching this in catch-up mode on YouTube. My name's Ishtar, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance. I'll be your host today and try my best to keep things moving along smoothly. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all meet today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And given we're online, I invite you all to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the lands of where you're joining this webinar from as well. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and all those First Nations people working to close the gap on digital inclusion. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. The session is being recorded and it will be posted online for future reference. And today we're going to have a couple of introductory presentations, and we are hoping for a really open discussion and Q&A. So please do contribute your questions in the chat so that we can include those as we go. You'll see there's both a chat functionality where you can select to post a comment for everybody. There's also a Q&A box where you can specifically put questions that you'd like asked of the panel at the end of the session. So just to give you a bit of context on the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance, as many of you are aware, we're a shared initiative with over 500 member organisations across business, government, academia, not-for-profit and community organisations. And what brings us together is a focus on accelerating action on digital inclusion. Our vision is to reduce the digital divide and enable greater social and economic participation for everybody in Australia. And we do that by highlighting the national imperative for action and the value of key initiatives across the key pillars of affordability, of connection and of device, of access and of ability. ADIA is supported by Info Exchange, Telstra and Google, and we play an important role in helping to amplify and support the work of many great organisations working in this space, delivering initiatives and producing research to inform better programs in the future. So thank you for all that you do. We also seek to elevate the importance of digital inclusion as a national public policy priority. The need for a national approach to digital inclusion is critical. It will really help accelerate and bring together the efforts of so many across the ecosystem. And importantly, we promote the value of data and evidence in all that we do, in good policy making, in program design. And so it's great to be able to present this insights-focused session today. So no doubt everybody here is well aware of the great work of the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society in building the evidence base around digital inclusion. This group combines the efforts of researchers at RMIT and Swinburne University. It's supported by Telstra and the federal government. And what we're going to hear about today is the benchmark for how digital inclusion is measured. The data provides an evidence-based way to navigate the really complex relationships between different aspects of digital exclusion and the social and economic challenges that are faced by so many people across the community. Importantly, with 10 years of work under their belt, the flagship Australian Digital Inclusion Index provides a longitudinal view of the challenges at hand, as well as the opportunities and where we can emphasise our effort for greatest impact. The Mapping the Digital Gap project is an equally vital resource underpinning coordinated action on First Nations digital inclusion, and it's a crucial foundation to outcome 17 of the Closing the Gap framework around access to information and services. Relatedly, we welcome the government's announcement late last week of free community Wi-Fi being rolled out in 53 remote communities across Australia. This investment really will help fill a critical gap by providing a more affordable way for those communities to get online. Today, we're going to hear from some of the key researchers across both the ADII and the Mapping the Digital Gap project. We hope to unpack some of the real meaning behind the data. Our ADIA campaign for a national approach to digital inclusion makes clear the value of setting goals and targets for creating action and underpinning accountability on these challenges. And it may be that with 10 years of national index data and the latest results to hand, the time is right for discussing whether we should be setting a national goal to inform emerging policy and rally support in this space. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I hope you all are too. And with that, I will introduce our first speaker, Julian. Julian Thomas is the director of the ARC Centre of Excellence and a distinguished professor at RMIT University. He's also the program lead for the ARDC NCRIS-funded Australian Internet Observatory. Professor Thomas is really well known for his work around digital inclusion, and I'm sure well known to many of you online today. Julian is joined by Anthony McCosker, who's a professor of media and communication at Swinburne's School of Social Sciences. He's director of the Social Innovation Research Institute and chief investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence. Anthony's also part of the ADIA Governance and Steering Committee, and we thank him for his collaboration with us on that work. So we're really grateful to Julian and Anthony for taking part today. And with that, I'm going to hand over to them to set the scene.
Thank you, Ishtar. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think we're all really looking forward to a conversation about the findings, about the directions, the index, and our Mapping the Digital Gap projects taking us in terms of what we know, what we don't know, what we need to know in order to develop a more comprehensive, more illuminating picture of digital inclusion and the challenges we face with improving digital inclusion across the country. So it's a real pleasure to be joining you, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. This is time for a clunky transition to my slides. So I hope you can see them without any trouble. What we thought we'd do today is not take up too much time going through with you in these slides all the details of the index. We know that with the ADII we have a very knowledgeable, experienced, diverse group of participants in this webinar, who all bring a lot of knowledge and experience in this space. So we won't go through every detail about the index, but we thought we'd begin by talking a little bit about some of the aspects of the index which are relatively new, which we've introduced in our most recent report in 2025. So we'll do that, and then Daniel is going to talk about the most recent findings and developments with the Mapping the Digital Gap project and our First Nations data collection. We know there are lots of aspects of all of this that you will be interested in talking about, and we're looking forward to a wide-ranging discussion. What we say here in this introduction is not intended to limit the scope of that in any way, and I know people will have a lot of questions about different things. But just to sort of start then, I mean, we will just describe very quickly what we're doing and what we think might be most interesting to everybody in terms of what's new with the index. as we've been saying in our report and in our earlier presentations around this, we in for our 2025 report, we have introduced some new approaches to the problems of affordability. And measuring that, that is a critical part of what we do measure as part of the index. And we have made some revisions to that. The other big thing, I think, has been to substantially expand the sample of First Nations people. So Daniel will talk more about that. And also just recognising how quickly digital inclusion is changing, how quickly the digital environment is changing in which we're working. We also, in our 2025 report, have begun to address some of the inclusion issues raised around generative AI. And Anthony will talk a little bit about that and also the working from home issues once I've said a little bit about affordability. But before I go on, I do want to emphasize, and I think Ishtar was making this clear, but this is not our work alone. We've done this work with a significant team here at RMIT University and Swinburne in Melbourne, on Wurundjeri country, in fact. But we've done this work in close partnership with our colleagues at Telstra and with strong support from the Australian Research Council, which funds our centre, and the Commonwealth Government, which has supported our extended data collection. So just to turn to the basic architecture of the index, which I imagine you will be familiar with, we do look at these three dimensions. We see digital inclusion as a complex problem, where we see these different factors working together in many ways, but we do separate them out in order to understand what the drivers of inclusion and exclusion can be. So we look at access, affordability, and digital ability. As I said today, I'm just going to talk a little bit briefly, especially about affordability, because we have changed the way we measure this one. I know that many of you will be very interested as well in the access and ability issues, and I'm sure that we'll talk more about those. But just to sort of say that the changes we've made with affordability do mean that we are not anymore comparing our results in that area from 2025 with earlier results. We've really made some significant changes in how we do it. And this is part of what we want to try and do with the index. Although that longitudinal dimension that Ishtar mentioned is really important for us, it is actually more important for us to revise and update and improve the index as we go. And we know that there are many ways in which we can do that. So you may be aware that for a while now we've been measuring affordability in terms of the share of household income that can be dedicated to an internet bundle, a bundle of internet services, including a fast internet service, unlimited monthly data, and a mobile connection. So that's how we define a quality and reliable connection. With affordability, it's important to note we're not looking at what people actually spend. We're looking at the affordability for different groups of people in different places, in different kinds of households, the affordability of a reliable and quality internet connection which meets their needs. So that's what's happening. So what we did in 2025 was adjust the way we measured it to take into account how many people live in a household and use the internet. In the past, we made a distinction simply between a single person household, a single parent household, and and a two-parent household. So a very, very broad comparisons. Now we're taking into account the number of people in a household, which simply recognises the diversity of household structures across Australia, and particularly, in fact, in remote communities where we find quite different household structures. We're taking into account the location of the household, remoteness, but we're continuing to see a fast household internet connection with unlimited data as critical. The number of mobile services which we now look at is tied to how many internet users are in the household. So the idea of these changes is to better reflect the cost of obtaining good internet connections that meet the needs of the household as a whole. They're the big changes we've made to affordability. This slide just reminds you, I think, of the overall picture as it looks in our 2025 data, which shows the distribution of digital inclusion across the different states. You can see the differences between the states and territories and how geography is shaping the distribution of digital inclusion across the nation. This is a slide we use a lot, very busy. You may have seen it before. We'll come to some different versions of this, but this does show you the distribution across the different social groups. It shows, when you look at this, it shows how digital inclusion increases with people's incomes. If you look at those income quintiles towards the left-hand side of that chart, and then on the right-hand side, how digital inclusion declines with age. It's important to note some of these other factors which we see as significant indicators and predictors of digital inclusion. Over on the right-hand side, the disability is a significantly associated with lower levels of digital inclusion. Housing tenure and household type are also really important. If you look at those numbers for single person households, for example, or when we come to looking at household tenure, the figures in relation to people in public housing. So that's the overall picture, which takes together our three measures of access, affordability, and digital ability. If we look at that purely in relation to affordability, using that improved measure of affordability that I was talking about, you can see there how those different social and economic factors play out. The distribution across the income quintiles is even steeper. So a really significant gradient there from quintile 1 up to the wealthiest households. And you can see also how education is a factor. Again, how housing tenure matters. Household type is important. Disability is important again. And we still see that gap narrowing, but still significant between metro and regional households. You can see there's a very significant gap when we look at employment, and you can see there the figure for First Nations. So we asked quite a few questions also just around the way in which people manage the cost of communication services, of digital services, in order to get some more context around this. And what you can see in this chart are the sorts of trade-offs we find people reporting in relation to the costs of connection. The question is whether people are cutting back on essentials in order to pay for connectivity. And you can see the contrast there between, for example, the column on the left-hand side, which gives you the national averages. About 14% of people are saying that they sometimes cut back on essentials like food and utility bills in order to stay connected. And 5% are saying they often have to cut back or always have to cut back. If you look over towards the right-hand side of that chart, the one-parent families, you can see that very significant increase in the proportion of people who are saying they are cutting back on essentials. So 24% are saying they're sometimes cutting back, 13% are saying they often or always are. It shows just how important staying connected is for all households, and the significant sacrifices that people are now making in order to stay connected. So that's a little bit of a quick tour through the results around the overall results for our index for our 2025 report, but also just drawing out some of the kinds of key points and implications of the way in which we're now measuring affordability. Anthony, I might hand over to you, if that's all right, to tell us a little bit about what we found out about how the rapid take-up of artificial intelligence, particularly Gen AI, looks from a digital inclusion point of view.
Thanks, Julian. So I'll just talk a little bit, and I'll try to be brief in talking a little bit about our two case studies for this year. I'll talk about the generative AI divide, as we refer to it, but also a little bit about the questions that we asked around working from home. So in terms of the generative AI divide, we know that there's an interaction happening, and it's been happening in a very short period of time around the rollout of accessible AI tools. Generative AI is what we call it, but we recognize the kinds of tools as chatbots, as AI summaries, as all of those productivity tools that we're all seeing pop up everywhere, including in our email and our Microsoft products and so on. They're becoming integrated into everyday life. So we wanted to know a little bit more about what was happening, who was using generative AI, and in what sense, what circumstances. We also know that digital ability is a moving target, and that this aspect of digital capabilities is really affected by generative AI features. This is reflected in the data. Almost half of the Australian adult population are using generative AI, but again, use is uneven across the population, highly uneven, and it builds on the changing nature of existing gaps, we would say. So usage is absolutely concentrated among younger Australians, students, professionals, and this signals some of the benefits that those parts of the population are seeing, but also the potential exclusion for others. There are also some new interesting trends that are important to observe. People who speak a language other than English at home reported a significantly higher use of generative AI, so 58.1, than our English-only speakers, which is at about 40.5%. This might be associated with improvements in the capabilities of AI tools for translation or accessing information in multiple languages. And it points to one of the positive potentials of generative AI tools and the way that it's changing our digital abilities and our digital capabilities. There's a lot more work that we need to do in this space. Among those who are using generative AI, what we found is that text generation is common, followed by image generation, and also code. Some people, about 20%, are using it for code in the general population survey. Most common use case is actually interesting. It's about seeking information and or advice for work and for study, showing how these tools are linked to those occupational and study contexts, or the use contexts that we have for them. They're really creating new capabilities for us, new ways of doing things with digital technologies more generally. Some people are using them for entertainment and fun. And we know that that's often the case in driving mass uptake of new technologies and new applications. But what we see in the way that generative AI is rolling out through work and study is that these contexts are really driving processes of normalization, opening up new capabilities, especially for young people. Now, I just would say, I think we might have another slide on this, Julian, if you want to forward it. I'll just check, unless we only had one on generative AI. Yeah, I'll just finish up with the generative AI questions. We know that a lot of generative AI use is incidental use now. We will have to really rapidly work on, and we are working on, the questions that we ask. We've started with questions of generative AI use. We need to know more about how people are encountering and making use of AI summaries, for example, through Google search. Use of AI embedded in email services or AI-generated media, for example. There's a lot more that we need to do. We're focusing on the kind of critical capabilities that AI is bringing into being. Okay, so let's just quickly talk about and go through our work from home case study. So this year we asked about who is using the internet to work from home. We found that hybrid and remote work is now routine across much of Australia. It's interesting to think just over the last year even, or even since the beginning of this year, these trends might be changing again. You might be seeing more people going back to physical workplaces. But the map here shows the share of people who use the internet to do paid work from home at least weekly, is what we were asking. The pattern is clearest in the capitals, but outside the capitals, regular working from home is still common. Essentially, this shows the importance of the internet as an infrastructure investment if you need to do your job effectively. Access challenges have a significant impact for those people who are working from home, potentially more so for those in regional and rural areas. Just quickly, read in the context of the index, shows that hybrid work is widespread, but the conditions for doing it are uneven. There are some differences between men and women in terms of labour market and work types. And we also saw that 68% of managers and professional workers are working from home, and 45% of administrative and knowledge workers are working from home, and they're far more likely than other professions, which is what we would assume. I'm going to hand over to Ishtar, and just to note that we have updated our dashboard. So if you want to look at all of this data in detail, please jump onto the ADIA website and have a look through. Ishtar.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you, Julian. And yes, we can put into the comments, into the chat box, the links to all of the resources here, in particular the dashboard. Thank you. That was a great presentation, and it really is. We all know it. We're all living with it every day, but it's a great reminder that the ground is moving as we're trying to keep up and make sure we're understanding the challenge and making progress against it. And that is what technology will do. It will keep moving as we need to be using it for work, learning, and life. So the work you're doing is really welcome. Now I'm pleased to introduce Daniel Featherstone, who's Associate Professor at RMIT University, and his work has a focus on First Nations digital inclusion. Daniel has really extensive experience. He's got 20 years at least in the field of First Nations media, communications and digital inclusion, and he's going to give us an introduction to the latest Mapping the Digital Gap outputs. Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Ishtar. So I'll do the clunky transition as well and see how we go. So hopefully that's all coming up properly. Yeah, so thanks for inviting me to speak and build on what Julian and Anthony have delivered about the Australian Digital Inclusion Index. I'm also part of the ADM+S and based at RMIT University. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded lands where I'm joining from in Castlemaine in Victoria. So that's the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people in today's forum and to all of the country in which we visit as part of our research. So this time last year, my colleague Linda Normand Parker and I presented the findings of the oh, I've lost my picture. Sorry, have I just messed things up?
No, we can still see the slides and we can see.
Right, all good. Yeah, so we presented about the 2024 First Nations digital inclusion, First Nations research that we'd been doing through Mapping the Digital Gap, and also outlined the roadmap that was developed for the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group. So a lot's happened since then. Our team have begun field work for phase 2 of Mapping the Digital Gap. We've completed data collection and reporting for the national project measuring digital inclusion for First Nations Australians, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a while. I'll also give a brief overview of some of the high-level results that we've had from both projects, but knowing that we're short on time, I'll be going through that fairly quickly and giving you a brief tour of our new First Nations dashboard. Trying to find my how to progress this. Okay, there we are. So yeah, the Mapping the Digital Gap. So first of all, for those who aren't familiar with the Mapping the Digital Gap research, we've been doing this in remote communities across Australia since 2022. We visited 12 communities over 3 years. And it's a partnership with local organisations in each of those communities. We visit each year and work with co-researchers on the ground and really try and look at a place-based model of what digital inclusion looks like, looking at all the types of media and communication services available. And that all supplements the Australian Digital Inclusion Index to give a bigger picture about how digital inclusion looks across the country. In December, we launched our 2025 outcomes report, and that summarised the findings across those 3 years in 12 communities. In those 3 years, we conducted 32 research trips with those 12 sites, working with the local partner organisations. You can see them all there. We worked with 44 co-researchers and undertook about 2,000 surveys and 350 interviews. So we've got a qualitative element to this because we want to hear the experience of both residents and community agencies and stakeholders on the ground about how communications are used and what is needed going forward. We provide all of that data back to each community as an annual outcomes report. And that's really to, as part of our commitment to Indigenous data sovereignty, to provide the data for them to use for their own planning and advocacy. We've completed 27 of those community reports to date, and the final ones from phase 1 are being completed over this next couple of months. They're very detailed reports, so I suggest you have a look at some of those for your region, and look at the way that, the voices of community, what they've told us, and that's really what they're about, is providing all of that information from their perspective, as well as what we do is we add suggestions for a local digital inclusion plan. So that's a real place-based, community-led model for what digital inclusion can look like to address the needs and barriers that we've identified in the research. In 2025, we started the first round of phase 2. So again, this is funded by Telstra, this research. It's very much a partnership model, and we're looking at 9 new organisations or 9 new communities going forward over the next 3 years. So we did our first round in 25. We're about to start that second round of field work shortly. The other project we're working on that we started last year is called Measuring Digital Inclusion for First Nations Australians, and we put out our first report on that in November 2025, called Counting on Connectivity. So that is a Australian government funded project to look at the whole measurement of closing the gap target 17 that Ishtar referred to. For those who don't know, that target is to have equal levels of digital inclusion for First Nations Australians to other Australians by 2026. Obviously, we've reached 2026, so we'll be talking about where next. We did our first round of surveys partnering with Ipsos, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research Unit, to collect 2,000 surveys in urban and regional Australia. We also worked with 10 partner organisations in target sites in regional Australia, and that gets merged with the data collected through the Mapping the Digital Gap and the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, so that we can really measure the difference between First Nations and non-First Nations Australians. The project is guided by the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group, which was set up to advise the government on strategies to address closing the gap target 17 from a First Nations leadership perspective. This gives you a bit of a sense of where we've been doing that data collection around the country. So you can see the red sites, the Mapping the Digital Gap, where we've been doing that data collection. Ipsos also use a combination of face-to-face. So about 2/3 of those 2,000 surveys are done face-to-face in about 35 communities. And then there's a Ipsos iMob panel, which is a panel of existing First Nations people around the country who've signed up to do surveys of this nature. We also did 729 surveys with those 10 target sites. However, that was done a little bit later in the year, so it wasn't merged with our first round of the data. We're about to put out a second report in about April of this year that collates the data that we collected in those 10 target sites and gives a little bit more of a place-based view of how that looks across the country. So here's what we saw at the national picture. The overall gap is 10.5 between First Nations and non-First Nations. And then you can see how that looks across access, affordability, and digital ability. The biggest gap is in the area of affordability. And that really talks to the challenges of a primary reliance on prepaid mobile services for many First Nations people. So paying a higher rate for the data that they're using, lower household connectivity, at the same time as that, average lower incomes, and particularly in remote communities around the country, that the very high costs of living. So affordability is a real challenge. Obviously, access is a challenge, increasingly in remote areas. And so you'll see when we go to some of the data on the dashboard, how that looks according to remoteness, and it's very high in remote Australia. And digital ability, while it looks like it's not as big a gap, again, that factor increases significantly with remoteness. This is a very telling picture. So digital exclusion, what we see is that the overall digital exclusion, so that's people who are considered excluded or highly excluded, so they have scores of below 60 for excluded or scores below 50 for highly excluded. So it's double the rate for First Nations people relative to non-First Nations. And in the Mapping the Digital Gap research sites, it's 73, nearly 3 in 4 people are considered digitally excluded, and 47%, so nearly half of those are highly digitally excluded. We'll drill down a bit on that in the dashboard. So I thought rather than showing more graphs, I'll actually show you how it looks in the dashboard. So I'll just stop sharing for a sec and then jump back into our dashboard. And try sharing again. So hopefully that's all coming up properly. I'll just go into full screen. And so this is basically a new dashboard that's been expanded from what we had as a single page dashboard previously for First Nations for mapping the digital gap. We now have a separate section within the Australian Digital Inclusion Index website where you can go in and look at the First Nations dashboard that we collected nationally. So on this front page, there's a national snapshot. You can see the data state by state. So you can go in on a particular state, look at the data by remoteness area and how that compares across the different levels of remoteness. You can also go into a more granular level and look at it by Indigenous regions and see how that data compares. Now, this gives you the overall index scores, but if you go across to the toggle menu over on the left, you can look at that according to access or affordability or digital ability as well. So there's the different levels of ways that you can explore the data across the whole dashboard using the toggle menu. When you want to look at more of that breakdown, some of the things that Julian was showing in his very busy chart that he described, we can look in this breakdown at the data by state territory, by the remoteness as comes up automatically, by capital cities. We can look at it by age. And so we can see, as we would expect, that digital inclusion reduces with age. Again, we can go and look at that across the different dimensions as well. Down the bottom, so yeah, there's a range of other ways that we can explore that by occupation, by income, education levels, language other than English, people with disability, housing tenure, and so on. Down the bottom, we have the overall scores for access, affordability, and digital ability, and how those gaps look there. But we also can go into each of the individual pages and look at this in much more detail. So up the top, we can look at the access score. We can look at that by remoteness, by switching on that toggle, and look at how that changes across the remoteness. And this is where we can really see the differences. So for major cities, that gap is 7.8. We go to the very remote areas, that gap increases to 39.9. So it's a very significant gap in access. And that's not necessarily talking to availability of services, such as whether there's mobile or whether there's NBN or Starlink available. It's talking to household and personal access, whether households have home connectivity, whether people have access to a device to use the internet, and whether they're using those online services. There's fields for regularity of internet use, for the types of devices, the types of internet connection that people have at home, as well as devices used for internet access. So there's phone calls and internet devices. We also have a page for affordability. You can explore those relative affordability scores, so what the percentage of household income needed for that minimum internet bundle that Julian described, prepaid versus postpaid, and this is where it's very telling. In very remote, 93% are using prepaid services, and primarily mobile. The internet costs, so this is where Julian described that how many people cut back on essentials to pay for mobile and internet, and that's much higher as remoteness increases, and similarly with compromise on internet speed or data. Digital ability, we've got a range of questions in here. So when we look at this bottom window, we can look at many of the questions that we ask. So download and open a file, save files in the cloud, open an internet browser, use online services. So we can drill down through many of the questions and see how the responses change again by digital ability across the remoteness. But using this filter button on the left, we can drill down in a much more targeted way. So we can look at just the situation for male or female. We can look at the situation for people in the bottom income quartile, by employment, people with disability, and so on. So we can apply a filter that will show the results across all of the tiles on each page. And then if we want to reset, we can just press that reset button to remove those filters. So there's lots of ways to explore this data. We have a page on internet use, the types of services that communities are using. Social media use is obviously very high. And then a page for the remote communities. So we can look at where each of the communities that we've been visiting over those 3 years, how their scores compare relative to one another, but also over time. Now, obviously, as Julian said, affordability is started again in 2024. But if we want to look at access, we can see how that changed between 22 and 24, and similarly with digital ability, we can see the changes over time. And so we'll continue to map that over the coming years of the Mapping the Digital Gap work. I'll leave it there. Obviously, there's lots to explore in there, but I know we're running out of time. So I'll hand back to Ishtar to take us to our question and answers.
Thanks so much, Daniel. So much really kind of incredible data there. And it's worth mentioning again the work that you guys put into going out into communities and having all of those conversations to bring that depth of engagement and the way that you share that data back to community as well. I think it's really worth noting. We're now going to move into the Q&A part of the discussion. I can see there's a few questions in the chat. Please do add more. We welcome all the questions. First of all, I thought I would kind of start really big picture. You've been in and around these challenges of digital inclusion and drilling into the data around them for some time now, and I would be curious to hear what your kind of big picture reflections are on where Australia is up to, what we can learn from the research, with a view to what we do next. What are some of the most striking insights for you? I don't know who wants to take that one first.
You go, Julian.
Should I jump in first? I think we've probably all got different angles on that. It's a great question, and I'd be really interested in other people's thoughts about it as well. But you're right, we have been tracking this for quite a while now, and so we have seen things change. One of the kind of key things is the points that I think came out of the material that Anthony was talking about, the way in which we are working with a very dynamic environment. That when we talk about critical areas like digital ability, the goalposts do keep changing, and so there is that stark difference when you look at the overall distribution of digital skills and ability, and then look at something like that chart that Anthony showed about generative AI. You can sort of see some really dramatic changes, and we know that's ahead of us. So I suppose the point about that is this is a really significant challenge which is still ahead of us. We keep thinking that we are getting to a point with digital inclusion where everybody must be connected, where we're all on our devices a lot of the time, and I think we underestimate just what a significant challenge is ahead of us. It's good to see some of the gaps closing over time. It's good to see access improving. It's good to see more people online as we've gone on with this research. But it's also kind of challenging to see that some of our critical areas of concern are, notably, for instance, in relation to affordability, just have not moved much. And we really do need to do more. The extraordinarily rich data that Daniel was speaking to really underlines those points. So we've learned a lot more about this over the last little while, but and as I say, it's been good to see inclusion improving in some ways, but the more we've learned, the more we've realised this is a really significant national challenge.
Anthony or Daniel, I don't know if you want to add your perspective to that.
Go, Anthony.
Oh, just very quickly. Look, I can only just echo the substantial changes that we're seeing due to generative AI and other AI products, but it's not that. So I think this is going to take us into new directions in terms of what we measure and how we measure it, and how we understand the kind of capabilities that ordinary people can develop and use in order to benefit from internet access. So this is I should just emphasize that this is just really a continuation of what we continue to see with any new developments, where the goalposts keep changing, the confidence drops for many of our participants, which means that we need to find new ways to build those kind of skills, the knowledge set that people need. But underlying all of this, access and affordability remain absolutely crucial. And just to note that we saw that only about 12% of our participants in the survey are paying for generative AI tools or some sort of AI service. The rest are using the free or the freemium versions, and that in itself creates disparities. And the increase of subscription systems across our digital services creates new affordability issues for people. So there's lots of work that we need to do in those directions as well.
Really good insights. There are so many new facets of this challenge that keep evolving. Daniel, did you have a comment on this section?
Yeah, look, I think it's earlier days in terms of being able to measure the changes for First Nations digital inclusion. We now have a baseline measurement that we can really build on over time. We've had a closing the gap target there since 2021, but we've only just been able to really start measuring that in order to know what the scale of that gap is, but also the nuance. Like, it's really critical that that we don't look at First Nations as one sort of homogenous group. It's very, very different according to where people live, according to the different demographic groups, and that there's going to be different types of strategies needed for people living in very remote communities compared with people living in urban or regional areas. And the sort of workplace needs are particularly different as well. The types of skills that people need to be able to engage with, education, with work, and with daily life varies. So, obviously we've seen affordability as a big challenge, but also that, access is significant in remote communities. A lot more needs to be done to support that connectivity at a household and a personal level, and to build the skills to be able to engage in all those online services that are critical now as part of our day-to-day life. So we really look forward to turning that data into activities that really meet the needs on the ground, but are very much community-led and place-based. And the First Nation Digital Inclusion Advisory Group are doing a fantastic job with the roadmap of providing that direction.
Yeah. You all spend a lot of time with the data and kind of deeply understand it. And so you are in a unique position to reflect on what may be obvious to you and not to others, places where the data can be really useful and where you think that it would make an impact. So when you think about where the data could be better harnessed across the ecosystem, are there particular areas that stand out to you, or are we all doing a good job taking your well put together insights and putting them to work?
Shall I
Sure.
just make look, I mean, it's wonderful to see the data being used really extensively and increasingly, and we see it being used across a whole range of sectors and in very different contexts, from specific areas of service delivery like health and education to broad whole of government strategies. That is really encouraging. I think it's one of those areas where having the data, having a sense of where we sit with this, has really empowered people to develop a whole range of responses and strategies and policies to deal with it. As we've always thought, when we're talking about digital inclusion, we're talking about a complex problem that sits across governments at all levels, across community organisations and the corporate sector. And we see all of those organisations responding and doing things, using the index to set strategic directions, to benchmark programs and interventions, to measure progress, as Daniel's been talking about in relation to the closing the gap framework, a really significant national level, all of government and community initiative. And especially, I think, and this is where I think the index and the related data around it, the projects around it, can be used more to identify opportunities and areas of focus at local and regional levels. We're seeing that happen in specific parts of the country, in western suburbs of Sydney, for example, in in northeastern Victoria as well, being used by different partners to inform, illuminate, design programs which will make a difference. We hope that with the sort of data that we're now able to provide, the kind of data that you've seen on that First Nations dashboard and also on the Digital Inclusion Index dashboard, that will help people focus programs and interventions more effectively.
Just add to that, the work in Western Sydney that we did was a deep dive looking at digital inclusion across Western Parkland, local government areas. And, that really came from the question of that the New South Wales government raised around if they were looking at investing heavily in smart cities infrastructure, in digital infrastructure and digital services, which is, one of those shiny things that the government likes to jump towards. They know that they also need to know about the digital inclusion profile of those areas. And that work that we did there helped to better allocate resources to set up particular programs that help to address some of the gaps that we saw, whether it was in access and connectivity or black spot gaps or abilities and services needed for education and training. So I think that sort of granular level of use is something that's starting to happen. But I think there's a lot more that could be done with the data that we have. We need more time, more energy and more resources, I think.
Yeah. And then on the, staying with you, Anthony, and the work that you've been doing around Gen AI and the skills uplift that's required in that area, can you talk a bit about whether and you see specific areas of opportunity and how we respond to that challenge, and what your thoughts there might be?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. Generative AI and AI just generally is one of those new parts of internet services and digital services and platforms that is actually really complicated. There's some straightforward sense that we understand that it can help with productivity. It can help us do our work, it can help us write emails, it can help us to translate text from one language to another really effectively. And that kind of capability jump has been amazing to see and is driving the use of those technologies. But the complicating factor there is that it also increases risks. It increases we've seen it increase the kinds of scams that are flooding those same services. It makes social media a less safe space for some people. So in that sense, there's a lot that we need to do in terms of thinking about what are the protective measures, the kinds of critical knowledge and skill sets that we need to bring to digital inclusion more broadly, and what place this has in the programs that we deliver and how we deliver them. And one thing that we do know is that everyone wants to know more at the moment about AI, and that's a good thing. It kind of brings more people to local libraries. It brings, to find out more. It brings more people into training courses. It helps people realize that there's more to know, more that they have to get on top of. But we need to see that as an opportunity, really, and use that as a way of thinking about what are the full spectrum skills and abilities that people need to get online and actually benefit from digital services, ordinary services, but also stay safe.
Yeah, and I think that takes us into a topic that's coming through in the questions from the audience quite a bit too, which is how these challenges intersect with particular demographics. So there's a great question there. asking about how the ADII survey is designed, how the data collection is designed to account for different cohorts, in this case, those living with disability, and the fact that disability has a broad range, right? And there will be different impacts on digital inclusion within that range. And it would be great if you could talk us through how you think about the ADII design and how it works with that reality.
Yeah. Julian, did you want to talk about the disability question? There's a question about nuance in terms of disability. We are addressing this in the next round of data collection, but it is something that we've thought about a lot. We have to, we've worked off the standard ABS kind of questions around disability to ensure that we get a good representative result on whether people have disability or are living with disability that are answering the survey, and then we can cut across those questions with the other questions that we ask. But it is something that absolutely requires nuance. I think it's like all of the areas that we survey and that we address, we actually need to be working with people on the ground, looking at their experiences, and experience is crucial, and that it would recognise that there are a lot of intersecting disadvantages as well that make things complicated in terms of the measures. Julian?
I think you've actually addressed some of these questions very well with already, but it's absolutely right. This is one of those areas which is difficult, of course, to measure and research. We can only do it working with people on the ground. We are also working with some significant research projects which are underway in this space at the moment, and always looking to improve and extend, if we can, the range of questions, the range of data that we can collect in this area. We have been doing that. So in the 2025 data release, which you can see on the ADI dashboard, you can access it all there. We've asked more questions about the way in which people with disability are using assistive technologies. We're particularly interested, I think, to sort of track how that group of people are responding, engaging with, or not engaging with key emerging technologies like the generative AI tools. So it's quite striking, for example, if you think of that data that Anthony was presenting earlier about who is using Gen AI tools and how quickly it is being adopted across different social groups. As he said, if you look at that, the called communities have adopted Gen AI technologies faster, but what we're seeing so far is that people with a disability are not. So they're sitting below the national average for those kinds of things, which sort of signals, I think, some really sort of significant issues in terms of how those services are being, at least, at this still early stage, but they're increasingly integrated into lots of everyday digital activity, how they're being designed, the degree to which they're accessible, the degree to which people have confidence or trust in them. So these are critical issues for us going forward. And just in terms, finally, of the general data collection, we have to make sure that our data collection is carefully stratified to make sure that we have a significant sample of those key groups.
Absolutely. Another key group that's coming through in the Q&A from the audience, and also something I wanted to touch on as well, is Daniel, this one's maybe for you, but for those living in remote communities, connectivity is clearly a persistent challenge. And as I mentioned in the opening, it's been great to see some new investments in this space, and more will always be welcome. But I wondered if you might speak to what impacts you have seen of increasing investment in these areas, and where the opportunities are in remote communities in particular.
Yeah, maybe I'll start by referring back to what you said in the introduction about the 53 communities that have just, it's just been announced about the Wi-Fi community mesh networks that are being rolled out across communities. So this builds on a project that was done by NBN to roll out community-wide Wi-Fi into 23 communities. It's part of the Australian government's package of $68 million of projects in the 2024 budget to provide strategies to address closing the gap target 17. And again, referring back to how our data is being used, this has helped, having that data from the mapping the digital gap has helped to sort of point to where the particular areas of focus are needed. But those community Wi-Fi mesh networks are a recognition of the fact that there's very, very low household connectivity. So it's about 7% of households have a home internet service in the communities that we've been visiting for mapping the digital gap. 98% of people with a mobile phone or on prepaid services, and the reliance on mobile is primary, but that means that in those communities where there isn't mobile connectivity, so it's about 700 of nearly 1,500 communities around the country don't have mobile connectivity. So they're the sort of small communities and homelands are still reliant on often a public phone in the middle of the community, or a Wi-Fi hotspot, or very little at all. So there's very little internet access in those sites. So every community is going to have different types of needs to provide the relevant infrastructure and services to ensure that people can access those critical online services, that they can be, on the journey towards digital inclusion, and not excluded by that lack of availability of services. So infrastructure is a critical first step. Then that access part of the way people can connect and use those services, and obviously affordability is a big barrier there. And then devices. So there's been some fantastic projects being rolled out to support access to devices, either through community access facilities or at a household level. But that access to, we see very low levels of computer access generally, but particularly at a household level. So again, they're all factors that feed into why we have such a low access score and why we need these targeted strategies to try and address them.
Anything to add on that, Julian or Anthony?
Not from me.
I mean, yeah. The other thing, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to keep us moving. But the other piece that's coming through from the audience is around both older and younger Australians as well. I know we have some specific programs to respond to the needs of older Australians, such as Be Connected and Tech Savvy Seniors, both of which receive some government funding. But on younger Australians in particular, how does the ADII and, in fact, the Mapping the Digital Gap project deal with data collection and those under 18?
We don't collect data from under 18-year-olds. We do collect data at a household level. We know how many, for example, we take into account how many people in the household are over 13 and therefore likely to be using digital devices. So we have some picture of that, but we don't collect data about under 18-year-olds as a general rule.
And I think, but it's a really good point in thinking through the huge disparity between our older cohorts and younger cohorts across all of our measures, practically, and the way that policy and programs need to target age groups, I think, is one way of allocating resources, and it has been really successful with Be Connected, for example, and Tech Savvy Seniors and other programs that are targeting older adults. But we don't see the same sort of targeting of younger people. There are isolated programs here and there. They tend to be around interest areas or work orientation type, get coding kind of programs, that kind of thing. But there's a lot more that could be done. And one of the things that we have always found with the research with older adults, for example, is the importance of proximity, the importance of local venues, and accessibility to those kind of places where some sort of training or support or help can take place. And we don't have that just generally. The importance of local libraries as a starting point. Libraries have been great as venues for helping people to engage with digital technologies just generally, and the internet and search. And they're underfunded and under-resourced in this area, and I think they would love to do more. And I think they could do more in creating those opportunities for young people who fall outside of fall through the gaps of formal education in particular. One thing that we can say is that for younger people, but also in our data, some of the most disadvantaged and digitally excluded are those who don't complete year 10 and those who don't complete year 12. So we see the impact later in life. And we could absolutely do more to target the issues while people are younger.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can speak to that for the work that we've done with mapping the digital gap as well. As per the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, our survey is for 18 and over. So we don't have the survey for under 18. However, we do get quite a lot of the anecdotal information coming through with our qualitative research. So the interviews that we do in the schools and in the community access centres and through health and other service providers, we do hear a lot about the way young people are both highly digitally engaged, and we know that they're, using social media as a primary means of communication with one another and for accessing news and information and other services. We also know that there's, in those communities where there's very low internet access, that there's a high demand on community Wi-Fi hotspots or any particular place where they can get internet. They'll be grouping around those places. And so this has been one of the big outcomes that we've seen. And I'll talk to Galawinku as one of the sites where the NBN Wi-Fi has been rolled out, is where young people would congregate at night around these little Wi-Fi hotspots at the shop or at the community office. They're saying, no, people are able to stay at home and access internet from close to their home now. Even though it's external access, they're still able to access it, at close to home. And the community have made a decision to turn that service off at 10 p.m. each night as a part of their own community governance over these services. But what we did see was that the mobile coverage, which was highly congested previously, meant that young people were staying up all night gaming and watching and using the internet because that was the only time it worked without the high levels of congestion, and that was impacting on schooling attendance. And so these flow-on effects of limited connectivity and access actually play out in other parts of work and schooling and other outcomes.
Yeah, there are so many interconnected pieces of the puzzle. Another question that's come up through the chat is around the impact of LEO-sats and whether through any of the work you've been doing, you've gained insight into what impact LEO-sats and uptake of things like Sky Muster and the other range of providers has had.
I can give a quick one again from the remote community perspective. We've seen a very rapid uptake of Starlink, where that's become available in communities over the last few years. What we see is that there's many of the service providers that have started to make that shift, if not already made that shift, to using Starlink as their primary service because of the higher speeds. Low latency has been an issue in terms of using cloud-based services and needing that low latency for those services to work effectively. And then having unlimited data use has been a primary one. Obviously, there is now the NBN Sky Muster Plus Premium product, which is faster and has unlimited download, and that is also getting take up. But we still see a very low take up at a household level of particularly Starlink because, at $139 a month, it's quite expensive to find that money for people on very low incomes. And so we still are needing a prepaid model to access household internet.
Anything to add on that, Julian or Anthony?
No, I think we're seeing, I think, a sort of similar kind of dynamic and distribution across regional Australia, taking into account the sort of specific issues that Daniel was talking about, but very rapid uptake of LEOs, and I mean, no surprise and no doubt that these are going to be a very important part of the access picture, the access ecology right across regional and remote Australia. If they are not already, the issues, as Daniel's suggesting, are going to be around what we can do around affordability and the work that will still need to be done, of course, in terms of digital ability and skills as well. So we just need to remember to keep avoiding that trap that we've fallen into, I think, nationally in the past, where when we've seen an infrastructure solution, we've sometimes misrecognized that as a solution to digital inclusion overall.
Really helpful insights, and you've given us all a huge amount to think about. We're approaching time, so I just might wrap it up at this point. Really appreciate everybody's time. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you to Julian, Daniel, and Anthony, and thank you, of course, to everyone online who's joined us today, and for your support of the ADIA and digital inclusion more broadly. We've put a range of resources in the chat. We'll follow up with an email. This session will be available online in due course. And we'd also invite you all, if you're not already, to subscribe to the ADIA newsletter to keep in touch with everything happening in the digital inclusion space. And equally, if your organisation has activities that you're doing that you think it would be great to share, please let us know, because we're always happy to help be part of those information flows across everybody working in this space. Get in touch at any time with us, and thank you again for attending and for your insightful questions. I know there are some things we didn't quite get to today, but it's really been thought-provoking in terms of all the different interconnected pieces, and there's a lot to do, but I feel like there's a wonderful community here committed to making progress. So thank you all again. I look forward to seeing you at our next meetup.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Ishtar.
Thanks. See you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.